everyone. My name is Jacqueline Lukeman, and this is Brick by Brick. So I'm glad you joined me tonight. Thank you very much for joining me on our regular Thursday broadcast. We're a little late tonight, but I didn't want to forgo this broadcast tonight because I really wanted to continue our discussion about the rise of the political black left. And tonight is very important because tonight we're going to talk about where the ideological split between Booker T. Washington's assimilationist, well, no, that's not quite right. Booker T. Washington's segregationist policies for the economic advancement and for the safety of black people in America versus the intellectual and assimilationist policies of W.E.B. Du Bois came from. Now, this ideological rift, this ideological battle for the souls of black folks is extremely important in the history of the rise of the political black left because it is the viewpoint, the ideology, the focus that W.E.B. Du Bois espoused that arguably gave rise to the quote unquote militant radical black leftists today. Interestingly enough, it's not necessarily from his earliest writings, his earliest ideology. But to understand that, we have to talk about it. So let's get into it. Now, remember, W.E.B. Du Bois was the ideological opposite of Booker T. Washington. And why was that? Well, Booker T. Washington's ideology was based on really social segregation. Remember that Booker T. Washington said in the Atlanta Compromise that basically black people would forego pursuing civil rights, political access, political activity, and social and political equality, as well as economic equality, for vocational education that would give black people some type of economic stability, but only in the service and unskilled trade positions of employment. The ideological shift came when W.E.B. Du Bois was very opposed to the idea that black people would give up their claim, their stake, to equal rights in this country. Du Bois actually, at first, agreed with Washington, but as he thought about it, and as time passed, he saw that black people were not only not benefiting, but anti-black racism from white Americans wasn't getting better. To the point that in 1905, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a professor at Atlanta University, exasperated Booker T. Washington's continued conciliatory policies toward whites, and Du Bois actually didn't like Booker T. Washington's enormous power within the black community. So Du Bois called for a meeting of Washington's critics at Niagara Falls, New York. And it's a very interesting side note about the Niagara Falls, New York meeting, because initially Du Bois wanted to hold the meeting on the United States side of Niagara Falls, but because of racial discrimination, no hotel would allow them to stay and hold their meeting. So they had to go to the Canada side to hold the meeting of the Niagara movement. The purpose of the meeting was to form an organization that would offer what was called then a militant alternative to Washington. Militant meaning aggressive, aggressively pursuing equal rights for black people. The Niagara movement renounced Booker T. Washington's policy of accommodation and conciliation, and they renounced his refusal to speak out on behalf of black rights. The group issued a manifesto that demanded the rights of black people to vote, to not be segregated in public transportation or discriminated against elsewhere, and to enjoy all those liberties white citizens enjoyed. Remember now, we are still Americans, and we're fighting for the same rights that white people have as Americans. The manifesto read in part, quote, "We claim for ourselves every single right that belongs to a free-born American, political, civil, and social. And until we get these rights, we will never cease to protest and assail the ears of America. The battle we wage is not for ourselves alone, but for all true Americans. It is a fight for ideals, lest this, our common fatherland, false to its founding, become in truth the land of the thief and the home of the slave, a byword and a hissing among the nations for its sounding pretensions and pitiful accomplishments." Now we have to pause right here to point out a few what we think are very prescient points in this statement from the Niagara movement about the political and social and economic plight of black Americans in the early 20th century. When they say in their statement that we claim for ourselves every single right that belongs to a free-born American, political, civil, and social, and until we get these rights, we will never cease to protest. It is 2017. Quite a few years later, quite a few years after this manifesto was written and published from the Niagara movement. And what are we still doing? We are still protesting, demanding our equal rights of full citizenship in this country. They go on to say that the battle we wage is not for ourselves alone, but for all true Americans. At its core, at its foundation, the fight for equal rights for black people in the United States of America has never just been a fight for our rights. It has always been a fight for the rights of everyone in this country. Because if we live in a country that is founded on the ideal that all men are created equal, if all men are not equally protected under the law, and if all men do not have equal access to opportunity, then how can it be true that all men are created equal? In a country where all men are clearly not treated equally, the fight for equal rights for black people has always been for the benefit of everyone in this country, so that everyone can have the benefits of this country living up to its own standards. I don't know if the writers of the manifesto of the Niagara movement knew how timely and how timeless their manifesto was and was going to be all these years later. But it is both heartening and disheartening that those words are still very relevant and very true. Now, despite the establishment of 30 or so branches of the Niagara movement and the achievements of a few scattered civil rights victories at the local level, the Niagara movement suffered from organizational weaknesses and a lack of funds, which is something that black organizations to this day suffer from. Same things, same problems. Also, the Niagara movement didn't have a permanent headquarters or a permanent staff. So it was never really able to attract mass support. Aside from that, Booker T. Washington also undermined the movement. This is how deep this rift between these two icons in the history of black struggle in the United States. This is how deep this rift was. Booker T. Washington assured that the Niagara movement received almost no publicity in the black press. He was very influential. And after the Springfield race riots of 1908, however, even Booker T. Washington couldn't stop the forward trajectory of the fight for civil and equal rights for black people. A lot of people credit the Niagara movement for the creation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. However, it wasn't quite directly formed as a result of the Niagara movement. Actually, one of the darkest periods in American history as far as race relations are concerned was the impetus for the creation of the NAACP, and that was the Springfield race riot of 1908. I think I've got a little bit too much text on this slide, but I'll read it to you. The Springfield race riot of 1908, the riot that gripped Abraham Lincoln's hometown, began when a white woman named Mabel Hallam leveled charges of rape against George Richardson, a black man. A white mob formed outside the Sangamon County Jail, intent upon lynching both Richardson and another black man, Joe James, who stood accused of the murder of a white railroad engineer. However, Sheriff Charles Warner had secreted the two men from town. The mob, frustrated and determined to sate its anger, quickly turned its rage on nearby black businesses, then a nearby black neighborhood. The resulting violence left 7 dead, 2 black and 5 white. Additionally, around 40 black occupied homes and over 20 black owned businesses were destroyed. It took the activation of thousands of state militia to bring the town back under control. In the aftermath, 117 indictments and almost 100 arrests led to only one conviction. A teenager named Roy Young, who boasted loudly of his part in the riot. Additionally, a woman named Kate Howard, who was arrested for instigating the riot, killed herself in prison. Another man, Abrama Rama, was tried on 4 separate counts against him, including rioting and murder. The jury found him guilty of only one charge, petty larceny, and sent him to jail for 30 days. This led to the conclusion by State's Attorney Hatch that, quote, it would be impossible to secure a conviction in Sangamon County. The Springfield race riot of 1908 was so devastating that it utterly destroyed entire black neighborhoods. Here's one picture of the devastation that was caused by mobs of sometimes over 3,000 white Springfield residents marauding through the black sections of town, destroying homes, destroying businesses, stealing property, assaulting innocent people, poor and middle class and wealthy blacks. There were a few. Allegedly for the reason of revenge for a murder that had occurred and the alleged rape that had occurred. All of the destruction are in black neighborhoods and of black businesses. In perhaps the saddest revelation, Mabel Hallam later recanted her accusation against Richardson and admitted to fabricating the story. The spark that ignited the events of that August night, leading to so much unnecessary violence and bloodshed, was in fact a lie. The silver lining, however, is that the event would prove a catalyst to the creation of the NAACP by black and white civil rights activists. Now, I think an important question to ask is, why did this event in particular cause white civil rights activists to suddenly become interested in working with and supporting black activists for black rights? Because of the location of the race riot. Springfield, Illinois, the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. The 1908 Springfield race riot was an enormous black eye on the city of Springfield. The riot garnered national attention, and as many eyes were being turned to the south rather, for the racist brutality, the racist terrorist violence rained upon black people in the South. Now in Springfield, Illinois, the South was pointing fingers at the North, pointing to the racist violence that was occurring there. And it just so happened that this event occurred very shortly before the centennial anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth was about to take place. As much as we like to credit the Niagara movement for the creation of the NAACP, unfortunately, but quite realistically, as this turns out to be true in many events in history, especially where the pursuit of justice for oppressed people is concerned, white people were not moved to get involved until there was an unconscionable tragedy that forced them to face their own biases. But still, this ideological battle for the political souls of black people continued between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. It grew into really a bitter personal battle, with Washington from 1895, of course, when he made the Atlanta Compromise speech, to 1910, he was the most powerful black man in America. Whatever job, grant, or any endeavor concerning blacks of any noteworthiness that influential whites received, white people actually sent that person's information to Booker T. Washington for his endorsement or his rejection. That's how influential he was. Hence, the Tuskegee machine became the focal point for black input or output. Du Bois was not opposed to Washington's power at first, but rather he was against Washington's ideology, his methodology of handling that power. Because on one hand, Washington decried political activities among Negroes, but on the other hand, he dictated Negro political objectives from Tuskegee. Washington argued that black people should temporarily forego political power to forego our insistence on civil rights and to forego the higher education outside of vocational skills of Negro youth, that we should concentrate all of our energies on industrial education. But DuBois believed in the higher education of a talented tenth who thought their knowledge of modern culture could guide the American Negro into a higher civilization. And that quote comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, is one of his later works, Dusk of Dawn. The culmination of this conflict came in 1903 when Du Bois published his now famous book, The Souls of Black Folks. The chapter entitled Of Booker T. Washington and Others contains an analytical discourse on the general philosophy of Washington. Du Bois actually edited that chapter himself. That's how incensed he was with Booker T. Washington. And he actually kept most of the controversial and bitter remarks that he had made previously and in other press outlets out of The Souls of Black Folks. But as toned down as this chapter on Booker T. Washington was, it was still more than enough to incur Washington's continued contempt for W.E.B. Du Bois. So what were some of the things that Du Bois said about Washington that were so terrible? Directly from The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois says that Mr. Washington came with a simple, definite program at the psychological moment when the nation was a little ashamed of having bestowed so much sentiment on Negroes, sentiment not being a positive word in this context, and was concentrating its energies on dollars. His program of industrial education, conciliation of the South, and submission and silence as to civil and political rights was not wholly original. The free Negroes from 1830 up to wartime had striven to build industrial schools, and the American Missionary Association had from the first taught various trades. And Price and others had sought a way of honorable alliance with the best of the Southerners. But Mr. Washington first indissolubly linked these things. Washington was the first person to put all these ideas together in one plan. He put enthusiasm, unlimited energy, and perfect faith into his program and changed it from a bypath into a veritable way of life. And the tale of the methods by which he did this is a fascinating study of human life. If you recall, in our last episode, we talked about Booker T. Washington's penchant for making white people comfortable with him by telling racist jokes about black people. How Booker T. Washington would ingratiate himself with the white Southerners who he needed to get money from by being just as critical of black people, and especially poor black people, as they were. Even though Washington doing this was a means to an end, and what he believed to be a noble end, W.E.B. Du Bois criticized the fact that he did it at all. Du Bois goes on to say, it startled the nation to hear a Negro advocating such a program after many decades of bitter complaint. It startled and won the applause of the South. It interested and won the admiration of the North, and after a confused murmur of protest, it silenced, if it did not convert, the Negroes themselves. Mr. Washington represents in Negro thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission, but adjustment at such a peculiar time as to make his program unique. In answer to the racial animus towards blacks, it has been claimed that the Negro can survive only through submission, DuBois says. Mr. Washington distinctly asks that black people give up, at least for the present, three things. First, political power. Second, insistence on civil rights. Third, higher education of Negro youth, and concentrate all their energies on industrial education and accumulation of wealth and the conciliation of the South. This policy has been courageously and insistently advocated for over 15 years and has been triumphant for perhaps 10 years. As a result of this tender of the palm branch, what has been the return? In these years, there have occurred the disenfranchisement of the Negro, the legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro, the legalized second-class citizenship of black people, the steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for the higher training of the Negro. These movements are not, to be sure, direct result of Mr. Washington's teachings, but his propaganda has, without a shadow of a doubt, helped their speedier accomplishment. And here is where W.E.B. Du Bois continues or begins to offer his alternative to Booker T. Washington's plan of racist conciliation or complied segregation. Du Bois says the other class of Negroes who cannot agree with Mr. Washington has hitherto said little aloud. They deprecate the sight of scattered counsels of internal disagreement, and especially they dislike making their just criticism of a useful and earnest man an excuse for a general discharge of venom from small-minded opponents. I have to put a pin in that slide, and I have to come over here and talk to you about something that we just saw over the past 8 years that W.E.B. Du Bois actually talked about right there in that slide. One of the reasons so many black academics, black politicos, black people in general did not criticize President Barack Obama was because of the phenomenon that W.E.B. Du Bois just described. Not only do we not want to be seen as giving fuel to racists' fire against the first black president or any black political figure, we also don't want to be seen as being people who can't agree with each other. We don't want our internal disagreements to be aired. We dislike making even our valid criticism of someone who is qualified and has earned the right to that position. We don't want that valid criticism to be made or used as an excuse for other people to dismiss, other people meaning white people, to dismiss the qualifications of this person, this black person of noteworthiness. This is something that has been a struggling point, something that black people have grappled with forever. We've always been very mindful of how closely we're all watched in American society, but we're extremely protective of those of us who rise to certain heights that most of us don't. Because we know that those people will be watched even more. We know that they will be criticized even more harshly than we are criticized. We know that their qualifications will be questioned. We know that their fitness for the position will be doubted. We know that they will receive racist attacks. So we are incredibly, and sometimes to a fault, protective of our black luminaries. Yes, we do have a preoccupation with image, but it's not that simple all the time. As W.E.B. Du Bois very eloquently explained, in the case of people who disagreed with Booker T. Washington quite vehemently, it wasn't as easy for them to come out publicly with their disagreement because of how they knew their disagreement would be used not just against Booker T. Washington, but against all black people. That's the tightrope we have always walked with politics in this country. Let's go on and finish W.E.B. Du Bois's perspective on how to advance equality and civil rights for black people. So Du Bois continues to say that such men who disagree with Washington feel in conscience bound to ask of this nation rather three things: the right to vote, civil equality, the education of youth according to ability. They acknowledge Mr. Washington's invaluable service in counseling patients and courtesy in such demands. And here is the key. Here is where W.E.B. Du Bois's perspective is also troubling for black people. They do not ask that ignorant black men vote when ignorant whites are debarred, or that any reasonable restrictions in the suffrage should not be applied. They know that the low social level of the mass of the race is responsible for much discrimination against it. Basically, this is W.E.B. Du Bois echoing the racist sentiment that it is poor blacks, it is the least among black people who are the problem for all blacks. So in this regard, Du Bois was an assimilationist. He wanted to take the so-called cream of the crop of the black race, what he called the talented tenth, and have those people shepherd the masses out of their backward and animalistic and problematic ways that were the scorn of the entire black race from white people. Du Bois actually coined the expression talented tenth in a 1903 essay in his volume, The Negro Problem. He said the Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented tenth. It is the problem of developing the best of this race, that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races. This is another very problematic and very dangerous ideology that we can't help but recognize comes from living in a society in which our very being is criminalized and dehumanized. You see, W.E.B. Du Bois, even with his massive intellect, for any man, not just among black men, but he was a giant of intellectual fortitude out of humanity. Even he was subjected to believing racist ideas about black people. As much as he advocated for equal rights and full citizenship for black people, he still believed that white society's view of poor black people, uneducated black people, was valid in some way, and that it was the educated black people who would not change the view of white society, but would change the poor and uneducated black people to improve them so that in that improvement we can be accepted and assimilated into white society. It's a very problematic ideology. There is a part of it that you absolutely understand. Of course, you advocate for the education beyond vocational training for those who are equipped and for those who desire it. Absolutely. At the same time, you see in W.E.B. Du Bois's talented 10th theory some of the issues that we still face today. Some of those issues are elitism, classism, poor shaming, and victim blaming. That's blaming the disparagement of an entire black race on the perceived misdeeds and low standards of the poorest among us. And these problems in the talented 10th plan or ideology really does leave out the role of politics as a force that oppresses all blacks regardless of socioeconomic status, and always has. Interestingly enough, even W.E.B. Du Bois began to see the error in his talented 10th ideology. The longer he lived, the more he realized that there really is nothing black people can do in this society that will cause much of white society to look at us as equal. There is no amount of education. There is no amount of wealth that we can achieve. There's no amount of respectable social standing that we can uphold that will cause much of white society to no longer look at us as associated with the least among us and to look at us as equal. In his later life, Du Bois came to believe that leadership could arise from many levels, not just the talented 10th. And grassroots efforts were also important to social change. The best among us were not the most or best equipped out of all of us to lead us anywhere. Leadership can come from any of us. His stepson, David Du Bois, tried to publicize those views, writing in 1972 that Dr. Du Bois's conviction that it's those who suffered most and have the least to lose that we should look to for our steadfast, dependable, and uncompromising leadership. It's quite a change from the man who believed that it was the best among us who would lead the masses away from our debauched ways into acceptance and assimilation into American society. Even later, in Dusk of Dawn, in a collection of his writings, Du Bois redefined his notion, acknowledging contributions by other men, not of so-called high education and social standing. He writes that, quote, "My own panacea of earlier day was flight of class from mass, encouraging the more educated and wealthier among us to leave the masses behind if they could not be lifted up," allegedly. Through the development of the talented 10th, but the power of this aristocracy of talent was to lie in its knowledge and character, not in its wealth. It's worthy to note that W.E.B. Du Bois lived long enough to see so many changes in American society, to see so many different presidential administrations come and go, to participate in many presidential elections, and to be disappointed by Republican and Democratic politicians and parties alike, that in 1956, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an article for the Nation magazine where he declared that in the 1956 election, he just wasn't going to vote. He listed all of the presidential elections that he had voted in and the political party affiliation of each of the candidates. And he listed how each of the candidates, each of the presidents, each of the parties left black people behind, made promises, some of them. Some didn't even bother to make promises. But every politician, each party, left black people behind. And he went on to further say that he was so frustrated with the way third parties were treated in the American political system because the two parties crush and drown out any mention or access that third party candidates could have. So people are never educated on the opportunities or the policies that third party candidates could offer them. So voters really never have a choice. This was in 1956. An essay written by W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1903 believed that the best among black people, the most educated and the wealthiest among us, could rise the ignorant masses out of our muck and prove our worth to be assimilated into white society. He had gotten to the point in 1956, after seeing as much as he could take of the American political system, that the entire system had no interest in making space for us. Not only did W.E.B. Du Bois not vote in 1956, but throughout his time working with the Niagara Movement, the NAACP, and advocating for equality and full citizenship rights for black people, he became more and more interested in the Pan-African movement, and a figure that loomed large and grew quite prominent in the United States, who made Pan-Africanism a household word among black families. And that person was Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois didn't always see eye to eye. Du Bois wasn't always entirely supportive of Marcus Garvey. But it was Marcus Garvey's push for Pan-Africanism, push for the community building of black people in this country, and his creation of the largest black organization that has probably ever existed in this country, save possibly the NAACP, that continued to fuel W.E.B. Du Bois's continued focus on Pan-Africanism, as well as alternative political options such as socialism and even communism. As I said, Du Bois lived long enough to see this political system not serve black people, no matter what we did, to the point that he became a socialist. And then he became involved with the Communist Party, and he became a target of the McCarthy communist congressional hearings. At one point, He was working with Ghanaian intellectuals on an encyclopedia of the African diaspora. W.E.B. Du Bois, ever the intellectual, ever the educator, ever the advocate for Black people knowing who we are, was working with Ghanaian intellectuals to create an encyclopedia for Black people, tying together our histories on the continent we were taken from and connecting us here in our adopted and bled for home. But because he was a target of the McCarthy congressional trials, the anti-American congressional trials, his passport was not renewed as he was in Ghana. And even though he said he would renounce his American citizenship, he never publicly did, but he did not return to the United States. His health failed, and he eventually died in Ghana. And it is at this point in the history of Black political leftism, or Black leftist politics rather, that the idea that Black politics are important to advancing civil and equal rights for Black people began to foment in the minds of the ever struggling, ever striving, ever fighting population of Black people in America. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about Marcus Garvey, and we'll see where that leads. I hope that this broadcast tonight exposed you to a little bit of information that you did not know before. I hope you learned a little something new. And I hope you enjoyed it so much that you will share this video, you will like this page, you will subscribe to us on YouTube, you'll follow us on Twitter, and you will contribute to our Patreon page for Lukeman Nation, either become a monthly patron or give us a one-time donation so we can continue to do this. So we can continue to take down this wall of misinformation, lies, and untruths, and to build a better foundation for all of us, and to build it brick by brick. My name is Jacqueline Lukeman, and this has been Brick by Brick. Thank you, and good night. Building it brick by brick. I'm looking at his later life, and apparently he was called before